In the video where I talked about what is a double die, I really glossed over what they are. I simplified it to make it really just an introduction and a basic understanding of what a double die is, but there's so much more to understand about what double dies are. In fact, a lot of double dies can't even be accounted for in the brief explanation of what I explained, because I said it was a multiple squeeze process where there's a misalignment, and we haven't used a multiple squeeze hubbing process in almost 30 years. And we still have double dies happening to this day, so I really need to explain a lot more about the different types of double dies and how they occur. So in this video, I'm going to use a lot of things I've already talked about in the last video, so I would definitely recommend you watch this video right here that covers the basics of what a double die is. But just to sum it up real fast in case you don't want to go back and watch that, a double die in general is where you have two impressions of the design on the die that makes coins from the hubbing process where the die is made. It doesn't exist because of something that happens when the coin is struck, and it happens when the die itself is made. There's doubling on the die, and because it's on the die that makes the coins, every single coin struck by that die will have the same doubling on it. Well, now that I've summed up that much longer video in about 1 minute, let's go on and talk about the 8 different classes of double dies and the potential 9th class of double die, depending on who you ask. I do want to thank Chuck Daughtrey with coppercoins.com for permission to use some of the pictures we're using for the varieties today. And if you're interested in Lincoln cent double dies and repunch mint marks, definitely check out coppercoins.com. It's an absolute treasure trove of information and the most extensive online variety catalog for Lincoln cents. Traditionally, there have been 8 different classes of double dies that account for different ways in which double dies happen on dies that make the coins. However, there is another class of double die that I didn't even account for being a possibility in my explanation in the previous video, and that's where I really need to cover some more stuff. Although there was a multiple squeeze hubbing process where you would have numerous squeezes, not just even 2, that's how we see like triple and quadruple die obverse coins, we stopped using a multiple squeeze hubbing process over the course of about a decade from the late 80s to the late 90s, and in 1996 we finally went completely to a single squeeze hubbing process to make coin dies. So ever since then, there's been a single squeeze process in making those dies, which was an attempt by the mint to reduce double dies. However, some other stuff ended up being a factor in the way they make dies, so we still have double dies. Spoiler alert, but we're going to get into that in just a minute. However, understanding that it's those multiple squeezes for most double dies that happened prior to 1996 helps to explain what's going on and why we actually see doubling on coins, especially really strong doubling like the 1955 double die obverse and so on and so forth with the long list of double die coins. Class 1 doubling is called rotated hub doubling, and if you think about it kind of like a clock and hands kind of rotating around a clock face, that's pretty much what's happening. You have a second impression where one of the hubbings was basically rotated, kind of like a clock. So you see all of the design elements kind of shift around a certain number of degrees. Now this doesn't always happen perfectly centered on the die, so you can see in some instances where one side of the die will have a closer spread and the other one might have a wider spread, but everything kind of rotates around clockwise or counterclockwise. And for this one, it is focused on the general center of the die with everything rotating around the center. A great example of this one is the king of double dies, the 1955 double die obverse. You can really see how well that rotates around the center of the coin. Class 2 doubling is distorted hub doubling, and this is going to be where the spread is toward the rim or towards the center of the coin all the way around the coin. So it's either working its way inwards or outwards. And if you think about that whole thing of it being a misalignment, this doesn't make sense here because it doesn't account for it. A misalignment wouldn't cause things to spread inwards or outwards on the die. So what's happening here? It got the name distorted hub doubling from an older understanding of what was going on, which might actually be happening on some instances of this doubling, but the older understanding was basically that it was deterioration of the hub, that the older hub, which was deteriorated, paired with a newer hub that was nice and crisp, would yield a spread outwards or inwards depending on which one was on top of the other one, with the older hub having more of a spread out appearance from overuse of the hub. However, a subsequent understanding of what's probably going on here that actually is supported by some research on this particular topic has been that it's actually a product of the annealing process of the die. Annealing is where you heat up metal to soften it, basically. And whenever you have that much pressure going from one piece of metal into another, you want one of them to be softer, because soft metal is happy metal when you have thousands of pounds of pressure and you're trying to get a design from a hub impressed onto the die. Well, what happens to something when it gets heated up? It expands. And whenever it expands, eventually as it cools, it will contract. So in this instance, when the die is heated up in the annealing process and it gets hubbed, it might not have shrunk back to its normal size quite yet. Or if it's been annealed and it's heated up and it's expanded, maybe it's cooled down before it gets to the second hubbing and hasn't been re-annealed in the meantime. Now, dies can be annealed numerous times during the hubbing, so it's not that it just gets annealed once and then it might never get annealed again. It could be annealed in between each of the hubbings of that die. However, if it's not consistent with the expansion of the die from the annealing process in the numerous hubbings of the die, you end up with Class II doubling. Regardless of whether any particular instance of Class II doubling is caused by a distorted hub like it was originally thought, or because of this annealing process, either way you see a spread towards the center or outwards towards the rim. A great example of this one that's very prevalent is the 1971 double die obverse cent, and it's one you can't miss. Class III doubling is the one where a lot of people are surprised that this is a double die, because a lot of times it's not referenced as a double die. Class III doubling is design hub doubling, and it's where you have two different designs being hubbed onto the same coin die. For a year like 1960, where we had two different obverse designs, the small date and the large date cent, we have numerous examples where you have a small date over a large date or a large date over a small date proof double die, as well as we have that 1960 Denver double die obverse where you have the small date over the large date with the addition of a neat repunchment mark as well. But same year design differences aren't the only thing that fit into this category. A lot of people will refer to a lot of coins in the 20th century as overdates, but the US Mint hasn't produced a true overdate since 1909. Overdates happen because we used to actually hand punch the dates onto the dies, each individual die, which caused for some inconsistency on location of the numbers, as well as sometimes a repunching of the date. Sometimes it would get the different date on top of another date because of the punching. You would also have misplaced dates, all sorts of problems that would happen in adding the dates by hand to the dies. And eventually the Mint realized that wasn't a necessary step. They could just add that to the design that was going on the master die so that all the coins from that year would have the same date design on them. There would be consistency and they wouldn't have all those problems. So by the end of 1909, all the dates were already on the hub that was making the dies, so you don't actually have any possibility of a true overdate. So after that point, whenever we see one date over another, they were all actually double dies. Let's take, for instance, 1918. We have both a 1918 over 17 quarter and a buffalo nickel for that year. In that case, you have a 1917 hub die in which a 1918 hub was then hubbed onto that die as well, which is not an overdate. It's a double die. We see this happening on numerous coins, like, for instance, the 1943 over 2 Jefferson nickel. But this doesn't just happen on coins that would be called overdates, but they're actually double dies. In 1949 wheat cents, we actually have 3 dies in which the design for the 4 of 1949 is hubbed over the design of the 4 for 1948. In 1949, we moved to a more blunt 4 design, and in 1948, we had a pointed 4. And in this instance, we have a blunt 4 over a pointed 4, the 49 over 48 4, but we don't see a 9 over 8. We just see, for some reason, the different hubbings of the 4 on that particular double die. Class 4 doubling, a lot like Class 1 doubling, makes perfect sense when the whole misalignment thing. It's offset hub doubling, and this is where you see a spread to one direction, basically. So there's a shift either to the east, west, north, south. It can be any direction. but you see doubling moving in one direction on the die. A great example of this is going to be the 1936 DDO number 1 and DDO number 2 wheat cents, and those are ones that I look for in every single 1936 that I get in the shop. But another great example of this type of doubling is the 1909 VDB double die obverse number 1, or the FS1101. And the reason I bring this one up is because it's a great example of a coin that if you're still learning the difference between machine doubling and a double die, this one might trip you up a little bit. If you notice on this coin, that doubling does just kind of spread off of it, and it is kind of flat. So the first time you look at it, you might think, oh, that's just machine doubling. And I bring this one up to people all the time in person when I'm showing them the difference, because it does really typify what you're looking for. Look up here in the corners of the letters. You'll notice there's notching there. That is not something that's just spreading off of the primary letter. That is something that is a separate letter entirely. And that's what a double die is. It's a separate impression of that design on the die that gets transferred to the coin. Also notice that it doesn't look like the metal is spreading out, but it does, if you look closely, look like a separate letter. It's just a lot lower and closer to the field than the primary letters and numbers. But as I said, this is a great example of a coin to really study to help differentiate between machine doubling, which is not going to be worth anything, and a true double die, which is going to be scarce. Moving on to Class 5 doubling, it's going to be a lot like Class 1, but a little bit different. It's pivoted hub doubling. Now remember, in Class 1, it's a rotated hub. It's basically a rotation around the center point. Well, pivoted hub doubling is actually very similar. It's just not in the center of the coin. It's going to be something that happens where the pivot is closer to the edge of the coin. So for instance, instead of it being a rotation around the center where you see everything nice and even, it's going to be something in one of the north, south, east, or west fields as the center portion of rotation. A great example of this is going to be the 1917 double die obverse, in which the rotation point is from the west field, so you don't see much rotation in the word liberty, but you really see a nice spread in the 1917 and in the word trust, and the further you get counterclockwise on the words in God we trust, you'll see less and less doubling. Class 6 doubling, distended hub doubling, is one that there is a little bit of contention about what's actually going on here. Distended hub refers to the distension that would happen to a hub over time where it's been flattened out from consistent use. So some of the design elements get flattened out. So in this instance, you would have a distended or flattened hub that would make one impression on the die, followed by a non-flattened hub that would also make another impression on the coin, making a double die that would have some odd-looking characteristics to it. But this one is not strictly accepted as that being the main reason this happens. John Wexler of DoubleDie.com pointed out that he thinks that this is less likely to happen because there is so much inconsistency with these particular types of double dies. We don't see the same type of distension happening over and over again all the time, and so it made sense to him that it might be something else going on with the dies. And he thought this might be more akin to an annealing issue potentially, in which the expansion and retraction of the die, as we mentioned from Class 2 doubling, could cause a spreading out of some of the elements on the die based on the temperature of the die because of the annealing process and how big or small the die is in that process, as we mentioned. These don't really appear all the time like two separate letters. It sometimes just appears as kind of a distension, kind of a spreading out, and sometimes kind of almost like a blob kind of effect to coins. I think the double die that really typifies this particular type is going to be that 1943 steel cent double die obverse number 1, and you see some really weird shape to that 4, as well as some extra thickness in all of those numbers. And although we might not be able to pin down exactly what's going on with this particular type of double die, it obviously is doubled, and this is a genuine type of doubling. Class 7 doubling, which is referred to as modified hub doubling, has all but disappeared except for a handful of varieties on one particular type of coin in one particular year. Although DoubleDie.com on the section about Class 7 doubling says it might be a class that doesn't actually have any examples, Copper Coins and Variety Vista has placed some 1941 wheat cents in this category. Modified hub doubling is not just something happening to the die, it's actually a modification of the hub making the die. There was a really big variety for a while that was thought to be Class 7 doubling, and that was the 1958/7 Denver wheat cent. But that was one that has kind of been disproven. The research has shown that that one really isn't a thing and has kind of just dissolved away into obscurity. And before we talk about the 1941 Class 7 doubling, I want to mention one thing. Remember, I didn't say it was a modification of the die. I said it was a modification of the hub. So, if we had a modified hub that impressed a particular die, that doesn't make a doubled die. That just makes a modified working hub. Because every single die made by that hub is going to have the same modified design to it. So there's nothing unique about the die, and it doesn't make it a doubled die because it might not be doubled at all. It just has a modified hub design on it. And this is actually a thing with any stage of the hubbing process, whether it be a working die, a working hub, a master die, or a master hub that's making one of these other subsequent steps in the process of getting to a coin. Basically, any stage in that process, if you have doubling occur, if it's not at that last stage where the hub is making the die, it's not a doubled die. And doubling or something else that happens in any process above that portion where the hub is making the die probably isn't going to be worth a lot, if anything at all, more than its normal value, because it's not going to be scarce. And let me show you why. Because when you look at a die, it's one of many, many dies that have been made to make coins. And in this mock-up, you can just kind of see a small scale idea of numerous dies being made from this working hub. Well, there are numerous working hubs that are being made as well that are going to make dies. Well, that working hub has been made by a master die. If there's doubling at that point, every single die made by that working hub is also going to have the same doubling on it, which doesn't make it scarce. You can find it much easier, and scarcity is a big factor in any coin's value. So in this case, if it's on a lot of different dies, it's going to be something that's easily found, and it's not going to be scarce. And that's why a double die, one that's actually doubled at that last stage of the working hub making the working die, is rare and actually does have value, because only the coins struck by that die, for however long the life of that die might have been, are going to have that particular doubling on it. In fact, we have instances of doubled master dies, and in that case, you have, in some cases, every single coin made in that particular issue, or that year really, having that doubling on it, or at least a sizable percentage of them, like the 1972 master die doubling, in which we had two master dies made for 1972. One of them was not doubled, and one of them was. I can't say for certain, but from what I've looked at, it feels like over 50% of 1972 cents have doubling on them at Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco. There is an enormous amount of master doubled dies for that particular year. So that doubling is not scarce because it's on a sizable chunk of all the coins made in 1972. However, there are coins that were made from hubs that were made from the non-doubled master die. I know this is getting a little bit complicated. Follow along. And we see some amazing 1972 doubled die cents that are genuine doubled dies and not a master die that was doubled. So back to what we're talking about with Class 7 modified hub doubling. If it was just a modified hub, we wouldn't have a doubled die. In 1941, we have instances of wheat cents where there was a modified hub where one of the T's is really weird looking on that particular die. It was modified in some way, whether it be damage or intentionally modified to try and fix something. We have numerous instances where that modified hub is either hubbed over or under one of the normal T design hubs. So you have the modified hub over the normal T, or you have the normal T over the modified T, that kind of thing. Because we have a modified hub design that's either over or under a non-modified hub design, the normal looking T, causing a doubled die. And Class 8 doubling is something that again makes perfect sense with a misalignment context because it is tilted hub doubling. In this instance, there's a tilting between the die and the hub, and only one particular side or a small area of the die ends up being doubled. A great example of this is going to be the 1963 1963 Denver double die obverse cent, in which you see a nice secondary 3 there right in the middle of the other one. Class 8 doubling is most likely to happen closer to the rim of the coin because since it's tilted, it's really hitting one side of the coin first. And it might only affect just a small area, but as I said, it could affect maybe a side of the die as well. But it's not really going to affect the other side of it probably because it is tilted and only affecting that one particular area. Now this is where we actually hit that whole question of whether there's a ninth type of doubling, whether there's a class 9. This is where we hit a point of contention between different experts. And pretty much there are 3 different people whose information is available online who are experts in the field of doubling. We have Dr. James Wiles, who leads up VarietyVista.com. John Wexler, he's headed up DoubleDie.com for a very long time, but recently retired, and some other people are taking over now, as well as Chuck Daughtrey at CopperCoins.com, who once again has let me use the pictures for this video and others, so thank you again, Chuck. But when it comes to the single squeeze method of hubbing we've been using for almost 30 years now, Dr. Wiles, as well as Mr. Wexler, think it's a form of Class 8 doubling that we see on most single squeeze methods of hubbing. But if you ask Chuck Daughtrey, he says that it's a different process which leads to a different type of doubling. Class 9. But to understand what's happening in single squeeze doubling and to really understand why there are some people who really just kind of lump it into Class 8 and others who would lump it into a new class altogether, let's talk about what's actually happening in the process of making a die with a single squeeze instead of numerous squeezes and why we get double dies out of that at all. Because honestly, as I said, that's what the Mint was trying to do, completely eradicate the problem of double dies in making a single squeeze pressing method to begin with. It doesn't make sense of why we should have that until you understand the shape of the die blank before it's made into a die, as well as the machine that's being used. Before a die is made into this flat face piece of metal that has the incuse and reversed image of the coin on it, it actually starts out looking like a pencil. It has a conical pointed tip to it with a long metal body beneath it. This is so that as the hub is pushed down onto the die, it doesn't have to really impress every single portion of the die blank all at once. It can really start at the center and begin to work its way out. Now the die is a really strong piece of steel, so you can imagine how much force is required to make that die go from a pencil shape to not only flat, but with a design perfectly impressed into it all the way when it gets to the bottom of the press. So that's a lot of pressure. The machine they're using to make all this happen is a little bit different than what it used to be as well. The die is actually put down into a collar or a cylinder that holds it in place, and then the hub is placed above it and it's pressed down into it. However, there's a little play here. If you don't have an exact tolerance of the diameter of the die as well as the hub, you could get a little bit of angle going on there, a little bit of shift, and you also might have a little play from side to side. And that's exactly what we see in the single squeeze hubbing machine. We see some play there where the die can shift just a little bit and there can be a slight angle to the hub or to the die in that process where it doesn't quite sit perfectly in place. And what happens when you have something that's a little bit out of alignment and then you start putting thousands of pounds of pressure on it? Well, it for a minute might go down perfectly normal and start to press in, but eventually when it finds that point where it wants to just have that equilibrium where it really fits into place, you get a snap where the die and the hub basically snap into place in proper alignment. Now this snap usually happens relatively early in the impression of the die. And remember, since it's conical, it's going to basically only affect the portion of the die that's so far been pushed in and pressed in. So if it hasn't impressed the outer portions of the die yet because it hasn't gotten that far down, well, it's only going to affect and double the center portion of the die. And this is why on most single squeeze hub dies, we see doubling mostly at the center of the die. A great example of this would be all the 2009 formative years double die reverses on Lincoln cents. I mean, just think of all the extra fingers that exist on those particular coins. Also, if you look at Jefferson nickels in the past like 15 years, you'll find tons of double door frames on the Monticello cello on the reverse. And most of the time it's just a small little blurb or a secondary frame that's not very wide of a spread, but it is noticeable. We see this a lot on different national parks quarters as well. The Fort McHenry gets a lot of doubling in the window frames. We see the window frames on the Homestead quarter get doubled quite a bit. We see a lot of doubling in the grass on Bombay Hook quarters, and we see a lot of window panes doubled on the Harper's Ferry quarters as well. And it's a lot of doors and windows, I just realized that. But this doesn't necessarily account for every single double die we see on single squeeze era double dies, because there are some of them that are so strong it's just really hard to believe that that strong of a double die would happen just because of a snap. And we actually have verified proof that this is the case for one particular coin and possibly others as well. On the 2009 Washington, D.C. quarter reverse, in which we have Duke Ellington and his name is written there, we see a massive spread to the southeast of his name that's very, very strongly doubled. And in this particular case, the Mint verified that it was not simply a snap of the die. It was a Mint employee who was operating the single squeeze press decided to stop it in the middle of operation to make some kind of an adjustment. And because they made that adjustment, when they restarted the press, it was not aligned the same way it was before. So we get that double die on Duke Ellington's name that's a massive double die for single squeeze era doubling. Now before we get too far into that, let's jump back to that whole Class 9, Class 8 thing. Dr. Wiles and John Wexler's point is basically that since it is a tilted hub, it's just happening to realign so it only happens in the center. Basically, it is still Class 8 doubling. But when you think about it in terms of it being a completely different hubbing process, there is an argument to say it is a different type of doubling. It is Class 9, which is a single squeeze method in which a different function is actually happening. It's not that we're having a hubbing to where the angle is just different, and so it just affects one particular side of the coin. But I can kind of understand both sides, where Dr. Wiles and Mr. Wexler see it as just another form of Class 8 tilted hub doubling, because technically it is a tilted hub causing the doubling. But I can see where it's different from Class 8 doubling as well, because it is a different process happening, and it really only affects the center of the die versus Class 8 doubling more traditionally, where it was really more isolated to the side. But then we do get into those instances where we don't just see Class 8 doubling or Class 9 doubling, we see something else going on as well. There are a lot of double dies that happen in the single squeeze era where we do see not just the center of the die being doubled. For instance, the 2011 double die obverse cents. They're pretty darn strong. I mean, you can't miss that. It's pretty strong doubling on the whole portion of the die. That's not something you can just chalk up to an alignment snap at the beginning of the press, because it affects even the outer portions of that die. Now, this is an area of single squeeze doubling that I really don't even entirely understand myself, so I don't have a lot that I can say on this one. I don't know why you get some of this really strong Class 4 doubling on single squeeze dies. And I actually have intentions of talking to some people in the near future to try and further understand this, and I'll be happy to pass on the information I get about that. And I got that done a lot sooner than I expected, so before I even finished editing this video, I already had an answer. My hangup was I couldn't wrap my head around how that kind of doubling could happen in a true single squeeze process, and the more I thought about it, I just couldn't figure out what's going on there to cause that to happen, and I almost felt like it couldn't. I reached out to Chuck Daughtrey and asked him what's going on here. But Chuck confirmed my suspicions that that probably can't happen just because of a normal single squeeze. It probably has to be a release in pressure and then a continuation of that pressure, or in other words, multiple squeezes. So once again, we're not seeing Class 4 most likely happening because of a single squeeze process. We're seeing it because of something happening where maybe somebody's stopping the press, or something goes wrong with the press, causing a release of pressure, a shift in the die or the hub, and then a continuation of pressure in which it has a doubling effect because of the new alignment of the die and the hub. So I finally got my answer, and I've been able to pass it on to you just as I said I would just a few minutes ago for y'all. But I'm still really surprised that we have so much of that particular type of doubling, because that means that we're still seeing people stopping the press or something going wrong with the press more frequently than I would expect, because it was recognized and potentially addressed by the Mint as long long as 15 years ago. But I want to make another note too. You might have numerous types of doubling on a particular coin. You can have several different classes of doubling. It doesn't just have to be one thing. It's all a matter of what's happening to the die when it's being hubbed by the hub, and or what the hub has on it as well. I mean, if it's like a design hub doubling or whatever. So in some instances, you might see somebody categorize a double die as a class this and class that together. That's not something that's unheard of. And so don't be confused and think, oh, it has to fall into just one of these categories of doubling. Plenty of weird stuff happens to dies in the hubbing process, and you can get numerous things going on with it. But I hope this helps you further understand what's going on with double dies, why they happen, how they happen, and the different types of doubling we actually see on coins that are coming out of the mint. It's not as simple as I said in the last video, where it's just an effect of multiple squeezes of the die by the hub. It's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of different things that can be going on with the die as it's being hubbed, and we ultimately can get numerous types of double dies out of that process. But if you learned something today about double dies you did not know before, be sure to hit the like button below. Also, if you want to see more content like this, where I dive into varieties and I talk about more than just this is what to look for, be sure to hit the subscribe and notifications buttons below so you'll be notified when I have new variety videos coming out. Thanks for watching this video, and good luck finding those double dies.